In this lecture, we are going to test our Lambda function we just deployed using Postman. But before that, let's just explore our API gateway and the other resources that were deployed for us. So I'm going to go to our API gateway REST API resource here. Open the get method. And on the left hand side, you can see that you have different categories like stages, authorizers, gateway responses. So let's click on stages. So you can have different stages in your environment like dev, UAT, prod, and each stage will have its own set of same resources, same API endpoints with their own settings and configuration. You can of course have authorizers attached to your endpoints so that you're able to authorize users before they are able to access one of the API endpoints. It could be a JWT, JSON Web Token based authorizer function, or something like AWS Cognito based authentication, or a third-party authentication like Auth0, Okta, etc. Now you can also define some standard gateway responses. For example, if you want to define a standard response for all 500 or 502 or 5xx errors, you can define them here. So every time your application sends back a 5xx response, user will get the response that you define here. We can of course do that from the serverless YAML template as well. We'll see that in upcoming lectures. Similarly, for other type of if somebody is unauthorized to access your endpoint, you can define certain response for them. So getting back to our get method call. So along with testing from Postman, you can also test your API endpoint from console. So let's say if you want to test your hello world get method here, you can click on test and you can pass query strings, path parameters, and you can pass headers if you want. It's a get method, so you can't pass any request body, but if you have a post method defined, you can of course post a body here. So if you click on test, we're getting the response from your Lambda function through API gateway. So by default, the integration type that API gateway chooses for you is Lambda proxy. If you click on it, you will see there are other type of integrations that you can define. You can have a HTTP integration type defined. If it's an existing HTTP endpoint, you can do that. Yeah, if you're using a VPC link, you can have a VPC link type of integration. If it's some other AWS service that you are integrating with API gateway, you can have AWS service as integration type here. But we have a Lambda function, so that's why we have by default Lambda proxy as the integration type. Now let's go to our Lambda function. So this is our Lambda function, and if you scroll down, you'll see different options at the top here. So you can of course edit your code here. Let's say if I put a space, you can always deploy your code from the console by clicking deploy. You can test your Lambda function. Now the important thing to note here is how you can check the logs that your Lambda function generates for you. So let's say there is some exception while running the function, you would want to debug that. So you can go to monitor, view logs in CloudWatch, click on that. So if you remember, in our CloudFormation template JSON file that was created by serverless framework for you during the deployment, a log group was created for our Lambda function. Right under this log group, you will find log stream entries with the event time. Now this stream entry is created for each Lambda execution, right, with its own execution ID here. If you click on it, you'll see all the logs created by your Lambda function. So if you're debugging something, you can simply put console logs here and you'll be able to capture everything. So for example, I can go back to my Lambda function to code, and let's say before sending back the response, I want to log my context body, right? I can redeploy right from console and simply test it. Before you can test it, you have to create an event. So I'm just gonna name it test event 1. We don't need this. Just save it and then test it. So we're getting the response, and the same logs get published here as well. Or you can always go back to CloudWatch, go back to log group, and now we have another entry here as log stream for our latest execution. Just click on it, and this time we have one more line here, which was our console log, and this is the value of your context. So let's go back to our Lambda function here. Of course, you will see all the configuration, right? If you're setting any environment variables, you'll see them here. What triggers this Lambda function is defined here. So in our case, it's a API gateway that triggers our Lambda function, right? You can get more details here, what type of API is, and some method, etc., stage. Then now under permissions, you will see what all permissions your Lambda function has. So in our case, we have permission to create CloudWatch logs. So we can create a log group using this function, and then if you scroll down, you will also see who has permission to execute this Lambda function. So this API gateway has invoke function rights. Yeah, so if you have your Lambda function in VPC, you will see that here. You can define tags. So by default, there are few tags which gets defined. One more thing that needs to be noted here is the versions sections. So every deployment that you do for the Lambda function will get versioned here. So till now we have just done one deployment. That's why we have just version 1 here. If we update our code and deploy it again, then we will see version 2, 3, 4 defined here. So you can always revert back to previous version if you have made a mistake or you want to roll back a deployment. Now if you go back to our APIs, so we want to test our code from Postman. You can go to stage and then pick the URL from here, and I'm going to add a request type as hello world. Just name it anything. It's a get call. Simply paste our endpoint here, press send, and we got the 200 OK result with our response. So that's all for this lecture, and in the next section we will see how we can discard our whole stack using serverless remove command.